It was the year 76 before Christ. The sun rose over the Nile Delta, illuminating an Egypt that was no longer the empire of pyramids and legendary pharaohs. It was a strange, divided, fascinating world, a millennial civilization governed by foreigners who spoke Greek but dressed as Egyptian gods. In Alexandria, the cosmopolitan capital with 500,000 inhabitants, the streets awakened in multilingual chaos. Egyptian merchants opened their shops next to Greek philosophers debating on corners. Jewish families prepared bread while Roman soldiers patrolled the wide avenues designed by Macedonian architects 200 years earlier. It was literally the place where East met West. The port bustled with activity from dawn. Ships arrived from India loaded with spices, from Arabia with incense, from Crete with wine. But the true Egyptian treasure remained the same as always: grain. The wheat of the Nile fed the entire Mediterranean, and increasingly the hungry mouths of a Rome that grew endlessly like a threatening shadow. Common Egyptians, the fellahin, lived as their ancestors had lived for 3,000 years. They woke before dawn to work the fields under the relentless sun. They cultivated wheat, barley, flax. They fished in the Nile with hand-woven nets. They raised geese and goats in adobe courtyards. Their diet was simple: bread, light beer, onions, dried fish, and on special days, a bit of meat. Their houses were modest, made of mud brick, with flat roofs where they slept on hot summer nights. But in the palaces of Alexandria, the Greco-Macedonian elite lived in dazzling luxury. Banquets with elaborate dishes, imported wine, music of lyres and flutes. They discussed Platonic philosophy while eating figs and honey. Many had never learned the Egyptian language, relying on interpreters to communicate with the population they governed. Religion in this Egypt of 76 BC was a fascinating labyrinth of contradictions. The Ptolemies, those kings of Greek blood, had understood something crucial. To rule Egypt, they needed the favor of the Egyptian gods. They couldn't simply conquer. They had to be accepted. Then something extraordinary happened. While in Alexandria, they promoted the cult of Serapis, an invented god that fused Zeus with Osiris. Upriver, they were building the most magnificent temples in all of Egyptian history. The temple of Horus at Edfu, that of Hathor at Dendera, that of Kam-Umbu. Colossal structures with columns that seemed to hold up the sky itself, covered with hieroglyphs so detailed they told entire stories on their walls. Egyptian priests maintained rituals dating from the time of the pyramids. Each morning, they awakened the gods in their sanctuaries, dressed them, fed them with offerings of bread, beer, and meat. The temples were not just places of worship. They were banks, hospitals, schools, administrative centers. They possessed vast lands worked by peasants who delivered part of their harvest to the temple. For the common Egyptian, the gods remained as real as the Nile. Isis protected mothers and children. Thoth guarded knowledge. Anubis waited in the afterlife to weigh the hearts of the dead against the feather of Ma'at truth. Mummies were still prepared with the same meticulous care, because the belief in eternal life remained unshakable. But there was a cruel irony. The pharaohs who decorated these temples, who had themselves carved on the walls as divine kings according to the 3,000-year tradition, could barely communicate with their subjects. Ptolemy XII, who would rule a few years later, would be the first Ptolemy to learn Egyptian, and his daughter, Cleopatra, would be born in just 7 years, destined to be the last to carry the millennial title of pharaoh. But beneath this apparent continuity, Egypt was fracturing. It wasn't a fracture visible in the monumental columns of the temples or in the painted frescoes of the tombs, but a deep crack in the very heart of society. Egyptian peasants worked to exhaustion, paying increasingly heavy taxes. One part went to the temples, another to Greek officials, yet another to the crown. The tax system was ruthlessly efficient. Registrars measured each parcel of land. Assessors calculated each expected harvest. There was no escape. Families who couldn't pay lost their lands or worse, were sold as slaves. In the cities, ethnic tensions boiled beneath the surface. Native Egyptians resented the Greek elite who occupied the important administrative positions. The Greeks despised the Egyptians as barbarians from a bygone era, ignoring that this bygone era had built the pyramids when Athens didn't even exist. Occasionally, these tensions exploded in violent riots in the streets of Alexandria or Memphis. And then there was Rome, which observed, calculated, waited. Roman merchants flooded Alexandria. Roman diplomats whispered in the ears of the Ptolemies. The Roman Senate knew that Egypt was the most precious jewel of the Mediterranean. It controlled the grain that fed empires, possessed riches accumulated over millennia, and strategically was the key that connected the Mediterranean with the Red Sea and beyond with India. The Ptolemies, weakened by generations of fratricidal struggles, incestuous marriages that produced inept heirs, and endemic corruption, couldn't resist forever. It was only a matter of time. But here's what's truly astonishing. Despite all this, despite the foreign conquerors, social tensions, Roman pressure, Egyptian civilization kept beating. Each year, the Nile continued flooding its banks, bringing the black and fertile silt that had sustained life for 30 centuries. Farmers continued planting according to the ancient calendar. Scribes continued teaching hieroglyphs to the young. Women continued grinding grain on stones as their great-great-grandmothers had done 1,000 years before. In this year 76 before Christ, no one could imagine that in less than half a century, everything would end. That Cleopatra, not yet born, would be the last. That Roman legions would march through these same streets. That hieroglyphs would cease being carved, temples would empty, and Egypt would become a province, a granary, a memory. But for now, in this moment suspended in time, Egypt was still Egypt, ancient and new, conquered but unbreakable. The last gleam of a civilization that had survived empires, invasions, dynasties, catastrophes, and that soon, finally, would be extinguished forever.